The title says it all, Dining with Al-Qaeda. That's veteran war correspondent Hugh Pope's memoir of the 3 decades he spent covering the front lines. It tells what he experienced, what he learned, why he ultimately became disillusioned, and what it took for him to find redemption. Our Chris Isham last week sat down with Pope and found out just how nerve-wracking that breaking bread with the enemy truly is. Take a look.
I'm here today with Hugh Pope, a veteran war correspondent, as you pointed out. Hugh has just written a very intriguing book called Dining with Al-Qaeda. It's a book that chronicles his years as a war correspondent and a Middle East correspondent, I think the sole Middle East correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. And you had a front row seat and indeed were right in the arena of many of the upheavals and wars and crises and conflicts of the past 20 to 30 years. First, let me begin and ask you about the title, Dining with Al-Qaeda. Did you dine with Al-Qaeda, and how often?
Twice. And it happened.
It's probably enough.
Yes, they were stronger then. But I went to Saudi Arabia to try and find out about the 15 Saudis who were on the planes that attacked America on September the 11th. And no one knew much about them. And I asked a contact who led me to someone else who led me to a house near a mosque where Al-Qaeda tracts were being distributed and where eventually an Al-Qaeda missionary was introduced to me. And it was quite a frightening occasion because the first thing he said to me was, "I think I should kill you." And I said, "I do assure you it's not necessary." And we debated the point. Luckily, I won the
How did you convince him not to kill you?
Well, eventually it turned out that even though I was a bit worried about my visa, which wasn't quite the right kind of visa, I persuaded him that it was the equivalent of a permission that Prophet Muhammad had recognized in the first centuries of Islam for non-believers visiting the lands. And then he said, "Well, this permission comes from the king, and I don't recognize the king." And I said, "Yes, but the prayers on Friday are read in his name in the mosques." And he accepted that. He was the reason. He wanted to kill me, but one has to remember why he wanted to kill me, because he thought I was a spy and representative of the kind of forces that have so traumatized the Middle East for all these years. I think one must remember, it wasn't a one-sided fear.
So once you'd convinced him to spare your life, you had some dinner.
We went out and had a Chinese meal. Yes.
Chinese.
And he was even clever enough to try and pay for it with a hugely valuable banknote, and therefore forcing me to pick up the bill.
Did he say, had this fellow dined with Osama by any chance?
He had been in the camps with Osama. He could tell stories about what Osama was like, and he could tell stories about these 15 Saudi kids and their motivation, which was very interesting. I think that most of them were quite naive. They were reacting to what they perceived as the injustices of US policy in the Middle East as an initial thing, but then once they got caught in the Al-Qaeda web, of course, they became brainwashed and unable to escape. It was quite a flaky atmosphere in those camps as far as I can see. I mean, discussing whether it's Islamically right to play football, and then he told me about a couple of them had a homosexual relationship and therefore were killed, and just a strange atmosphere. And in the end, he told me a lot over 8 hours, and unfortunately, in one of those things, which is one of the themes of my book, is why Americans don't quite get the full picture about the Middle East. Even though I'd interviewed this person, it never got into the Wall Street Journal because I didn't have his name and I had no second source. And
really?
We were very rigorous about those things, and until I've written this chapter, that story has not been fully told.
Fascinating. Did he say how they were recruited?
I think that they were in a kind of jihadi, Salafi, fundamentalist stream in Saudi Arabia. And no, I didn't hear exactly why they were recruited, but they were clearly volunteers.
Hugh, why did you decide to become a reporter in the first place?
I wanted to be a writer, and I couldn't get another job. In 1982 was a bad time for the economy in Britain, and I graduated, 18 interviews, nothing, so I declared that I would go to the Middle East and become a foreign correspondent, and I never came back.
And you ended up covering quite a few wars. What was your experience covering those wars? I mean, for some correspondents it becomes a way of life and almost becomes an addiction. Did you find yourself falling into that at all?
I think I was too naive. I went into them without realizing the risks. I would drive into areas where, past the guns that were shelling somewhere, and then into the place that was shelling, and then crossing the front line, and I wouldn't really think much of it. I'd be scared, but not really considering I was too young to realize that it was dangerous. And then after friends got killed, and I realized the danger, but I still felt that it was worth it for getting the stories that you could get into the newspaper. However, I gradually felt that the risk-reward ratio was diminishing, and when it really cracked for me was the Iraq War, because I could see that the Iraq War was a dreadful mistake, and I was the only correspondent for the Wall Street Journal going to Iraq before the war, and it made so little impact what we were writing that after that war, and then seeing that it was indeed a dreadful mess, and knowing that as a British person, I carried the guilt of what Britain did to the Middle East, and as a Wall Street Journal person, I carried some of the guilt of the opinion pages, although that's separate from the news pages. It's a bit difficult to explain that in the Middle East. I carried the guilt that, being part of a machine that wanted the war, I had to, after a couple of years, I just couldn't do it anymore. I felt that my cloak of innocence had gone, and I wasn't protected anymore. And the line...
You felt that you were exposed.
Well, the line that we give to someone interviewing in the Middle East, I'm sure you've experienced, is that, talk to me, because even though we have great disagreements, if you talk to me, your voice will get into the media and will make a difference. And my problem was that I stopped believing that would make a difference by coming into mainstream media, because it didn't work anymore.
In fact, you recount an experience which was very frustrating for you in the run-up to the Iraq War, in which I believe you tried to predict, or you did predict, that this would not be a walk in the park for U.S. forces.
Yes. Even though I had been told through a friend of the family, told my father who worked for the British Ministry of Defence, that the war date had been fixed 8 months before, it was not possible to address squarely the question of what will happen to American troops when they get out of their tanks in Iraq as part of the mainstream narrative of journalism, because not only in the Middle East was it considered inconceivable that America would be so foolish as to invade Iraq, because everyone knew that it would be mad, but also American public opinion didn't know that was a realistic outcome. And so when we started planning to write stories about, my God, what happens if America invades, it was too late. And the story that actually addressed the history of invasions of the Middle East by foreign countries, showing that since Napoleon it's always been a disaster, usually the invader gets whipped and leaves with his tail between his legs, that came out the day before the tanks rolled in to Iraq.
But in fact, the invasion succeeded. Where we ran into trouble was the occupation afterwards.
And it's always been like that. The Middle East is weak militarily, usually, except for some Turkic dynasties in the past, but the fact is that it's quite easy to go in, and as the United States is finding, it's terribly difficult to come out.
Yes. Do you think the Middle East would be better off if the United States had not invaded Iraq?
It would be different, and I think that there was a very unfortunate idea, or a simplistic piece of argumentation, which was Saddam is bad, which we can all agree on, therefore getting rid of him is good. That was the false logic of what was going on. And I think it would have been better if America had not actually invaded. Bush Sr. knew that and did not go all the way to Baghdad. With all the consequences it had, it was better to leave the governing structure there. As the Middle Eastern saying goes, better the tyranny of better the... Anyway, better the tyranny of a mouse than the anarchy of a cat, or something like that. But the fact is that Middle Easterners prefer to have some order than anarchy, and that's what we produced in Iraq. I mean, no one, even after the war, none of us understood that the United States would not implement even its own plan for dealing with Iraq. The State Department had a fairly workable plan, which they'd worked out with Iraqis, and they'd gone through it all. It was all just thrown out of the window. And that is one of the reasons that disorder became so endemic in Iraq. So it wasn't just the war, it was the way the war was pursued and the aftermath of the war. It was all wrong. And I could tell you something from going to Baghdad before the war, is that America was winning with the bluff. Before the invasion traumatized Iraq yet again, the minders that we had that were looking after us in Baghdad were scared of going into crowds with us. The stock market was rising. Free market things were appearing. The foreign currency trading became permitted. People began talking freely. Yeah. All that was happening, but once America went in and took control of it, it became part of the problem.
Yeah, interesting. I just want to hit a couple of other areas, hot spots, before we wrap up. The Arab-Israeli issue. You point out the peace process, which has been going on for years and years and years, really seems to be more process than peace. Why do you think that is so stubbornly with us to this day?
There's a fundamental sharing of Israel-Palestine that has to be decided. And there's two forces there. There's the Israelis and the Palestinians. The Palestinians very weak, but with a very strong hinterland of the Arab world. The Israelis very strong, and with the undivided support of the United States, able to withstand that outside strength. The question is, what are the terms that that land is going to be shared? And as long as one side, the Israelis, is far stronger and with this unqualified support, the Palestinian side has no chance of getting a fair deal. And of course the question is it a two-state solution or a one-state solution? A one-state solution would normally be if Israel controls everything in Israel-Palestine, which it does. You know, you think of the West Bank and Gaza Strip as free, but they're not. They're completely controlled by Israel, down to the water resources. And so is it going to be a one-state solution in which everyone gets a fair deal, that everyone's treated equally? I'm born in South Africa. I'm very familiar with what it means to treat people unequally. And the Palestinians are different. They're 1/10 as rich as the Israelis, and it's going to be very hard for Israel to share on an equal basis with those Palestinians, and they don't want to. Or is it going to be a two-state solution, in which case that means that Israel has to leave those occupied territories and really allow the Palestinians to be self-ruled Palestinians. But can Israel risk doing that, knowing where the lines are so close to Tel Aviv? It's a very difficult decision, and I think that the best way forward is where the Obama administration seems to be inching towards, is treat all sides fairly and hold all sides to the same universal standards of behavior. And it's very interesting what the difference the Iraq War has made is that the United States is now in charge of two big Muslim countries. Just like Britain, when it was in charge of Muslim countries, that means the United States is responsible for no damage being done to sacred Muslim symbols. And that means that Jerusalem, for instance, is now an American interest, not just an Israeli interest. And it's up to Mr. Obama, as he has been quite rightly doing, in ensuring that fair play is done in Jerusalem.
Right. Well, it's obviously a problem that America has been wrestling with for many years. And it seems that every time it gets involved in the peace process, we go on and we go on and we go on and we get right up to the edge, and then things fall apart. Once again, this administration has tried again to insert itself into the Middle East and they were quite optimistic when they came in. And now they appear to be stuck as well with talking about proximity talks between the Israelis and the Palestinians. I think, which are not even direct talks.
Well, the important thing to remember is there are no magic wands in the Middle East. Everything's going to take time. Everything's going to take good management, and we can steer things to a better place, or they can drift to a worse place. And that's the thing to remember. It's engagement and time. For instance, Iran. How is Iran going to change? No one has the power to deny Iran nuclear weapons, and most Iranians want those nuclear weapons. So the question is punishing the regime going to really stop it? Not really. Does anybody have the power? Does America or Israel have the power to actually stop that? Probably not. Are sanctions going to do anything else except what we saw in Iraq? Strengthen the hardline regime and give the hardline regime an excuse for carrying on with its globally offensive behavior, perhaps? Or is another route possible, for instance, the Turkish route, whereby 1.5 million Iranians are coming to Turkey every year, seeing how a successful Muslim society integrated with the world, with prosperous and democratic and pretty secular and happy and normal. Now, over the years, are those millions of Iranians who are going to see that example of how a Muslim state can be an integrated member of world society? Is that going to change Iran, or is confrontation going to change Iran? I think it's time for America to end its blood feud with Iran, despite the awful things that happened in '79. I think it's time to move on, and I think the Obama administration seems to be moving towards that, and I think it is so much more positive with that hand that President Obama has out to them. Even if they don't take it, it weakens them as a regime in Iran, and gives more space to the people that want a normal Iran inside Iran. And it's inside Iran that this problem is going to be solved.
Right. Good. Well, we'll see how that works out. Obviously, that's a work in progress, to say the least, as is the whole area. But thank you very much, Hugh. It was very interesting.
Thank you.